The next step in creating our water tiles is basically adding the sand, both the sand on the earth part and the sand cement, as I call it, that will create the water effect, the breakers, the waves, and can also be used to create elevations on the earth. So we've waited and our paint is dry. So what we need now is the sand, something to mix it in and something to mix it with, and white glue. Now basically we're going to mix the sand and the white glue together, and the consistency is really up to you what you want to work with. I've been going with a thick mixture because I really want the elevations to show for photography. So the higher I make it, it'll get depth, shadows. When I put the white caps on, it goes around the edges and so forth. It's not as two-dimensional, it's not as flat. Because really, if you want something that's just flat, which frankly can be easier for play, because if you're making this for 28 millimeter, you can slide the miniatures across. If you're making it for epic scale rules where you're using small boats, like it'll slide across easier. But frankly, if that's all you want it for, then you can just dry brush the white effects on there, which is acceptable. It's the way to go, but that's not what we're going to be showing here. So what I'm going to do is pour some sand in here, and I pretty much just eyeball it until I get the consistency I want. Feel free to do what works with you, what works for you better. You can measure it, whatever, and then we just put the white glue in until we get enough. I think that looks good to start, and you mix it up. If it's not thick enough or too thick or not enough, just keep adding more sand, more glue until you get what you want. Really, if you're going to be using it to create the elevations on the earth, you don't have to worry about making too much, because you can just keep adding it until you get the amount you want. Now, I've been using this quite a bit, so we're almost out of glue with that, which is why I have a backup handy. Keep in mind that this will settle. So when you put it on, it will start to, it won't stay exactly where you want it. The thicker it is, the better it is at staying where you place it, but it's still going to settle and spread out to a degree. Okay, so you really have to keep that in mind so that you don't place any of your breakers too close together. As with the paint, how I said I always paint from the bottom left to the upper right to create a sense of direction that is uniform and consistent throughout the tiles, you want to do the same thing with your placement of your sand cement. Obviously you don't want it going this way on one tile, and then when you place it next to another tile, it's going like that. Because really, when have you ever seen water to act in that fashion? So you want to be as consistent as possible. Go with whichever direction you've chosen for your brush strokes. So we're just going to start here and just slowly dab it on and drag it out. Okay. Now if you get little dots on it and it's instead of lines, that is fine. You know, you just keep stretching that out. You got to remember that nature is not that uniform, so not everything has to look the same. You can have little elevations, big elevations, whatever you want. Spread it out. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you're working with these tinier tiles, oh, see, it does break down, fall a bit. I just move that over. When you're working with these tinier tiles, it's a little more difficult than with the big ones, because you've got to spread it out over this tiny space. It's 3 inches wide, less in some places. So it's not really a lot of space to get your effect. When you're working on the full foot by the full foot, you can have more intervals in between some of your breakers. But here, because the space is so short, there's not really a lot of space to get intervals and have your desired results of having some kind of elevation. So you just got to be careful how it looks. And it might look a little weird when you're just putting it down like this. That's to be expected. You are, after all, just adding glue and sand. But there's more steps to fixing it up, making it look good. So don't worry. We are going to have to go over this with the blue ink later. Now, you may be saying, Steve, why didn't we just put the glue on the base first and then paint it blue? Well, do you know what? That is an option, and you can go ahead. I've just found that because the sand and glue are not meant to be mixed, like they're not designed that way, it's not like plaster. What happens is that when it dries and the glue settles, you get tiny little perforations, tiny little dips, which is great if you're using the tempera and the white tempera and the Q-tip to put on the white cap look. It just really gives it a sense of it breaking up, whereas if it was just solid, it just wouldn't look as good. It doesn't have the depth, it doesn't have the three-dimensional appeal that it does when it's got some kind of imperfections in it. But because of that, what happens is that if you put it on the base first when it's unpainted and then paint over it, those perforations can go under your effect here, and then there's a greater chance of the paint not going in, because some of those perforations are just going to be too small for the undiluted blue paint to flow into, and then you're just doing a lot of work with touch-up brushes and the like. And you know what, you're going to need to do touch-ups anyways, so why make it more difficult than it has to be? I'm just going to go over this later with an ink, which because it's been diluted will just flow in anyways, and my base coat underneath will just I won't have to worry about that space because it's already there underneath the white effect. To me, it's just more efficient and it makes more sense for the end result I want. Okay, so I'm just going to keep doing this. I'll do some of it off camera, just so you don't have to sit there and watch me do it now that, well, it's almost done anyways, but I'm going to show you what I do for the effects over here. Quite easy, quite straightforward. Look, it's just a glob of sand. And I'm just going to, with this one, I'm just going to put some elevations without really much care or planning. Just put it random as the impulse suits me. And for the same reason, you can paint your base brown afterwards if you want, and just put this all on the white. But you run into the same problem if you don't base coat it before you put the sand cement down. You've got to touch up the edges. You've really got to push the brown in there and make sure it flows underneath. You can't really see it here, but just at the zoom, the level of zoom that we're shooting at. But when you do this yourself, you'll see that because it's glue with sand, it kind of flows. It's got a rounded edge as it starts to settle. And again, if you painted it afterwards, after you put the glue cement on, you just really have to touch up around those edges to make sure you get paint underneath it. Otherwise, anywhere where you have this effect, it's just white. The base color will show through, and you really don't want that. So it's just a time saver. Feel free not to believe me and do it yourself the other way. Hey, that might work for you depending upon the paint you use. But for the paints that I'm working with, my supplies, I have learned through trial and error that it is just better to base coat it. So I'm going to finish this off camera. There's no real need for you to see me just touch it up. And how I'm going to touch it up is I'm going to mix some more sand, some more glue, do this last section of blue, you know, maybe stretch this out a bit with my mixing tool, you know, just kind of clean it up, get it how I want it, maybe put some designs and patterns here, and then we're going to have to wait for it to dry. This will take several hours to dry, depending upon how the mix is. Obviously, the more sand you have, the less glue, the faster it will dry. that kind of mix is great for this elevation because I want it to pop out a bit more. But the thing to be careful of is if you try and make these bumps on your earth portion too high, is that they will take longer to dry because the air can't get in at the middle part, and you should probably leave it overnight just to be safe. It may seem solid and dry on the top, but you can't see that that inner core is still soft, and when you start to paint it, you'll either compress it or you could even just, the friction of running the brush over it could just pull it off. So just leave it overnight if you want to make these really thick or really large. With these tiny ones here, should just be a matter of a few hours, and then we'll be good to go and come back, give it another paint job, and move on to the next stage. Before we move on to the final painting and inking stage, there's actually one more thing I want to do with sand. And for that, we're going to need a wet brush, some white glue, and our sand. And what we're going to do is we're going to put some wet glue on here. You don't need it to be thick, you can dilute it. And we're going to put it on half of the tile. And so that's going to be over 3 inches here, it's going to be 1.5 inches, and then 1.5 inches out from here. And what we're going to do is put that out just to cover the rest of our beach, and we're going to have the rest of the area that we're not going to cover with glue. Later we're going to flock that with grass. So what we're just going to do is pour some of this on, and I'll just start it, and it's about halfway. Make sure the brush is nice and wet, and we're just going to spread that around. You want to get it right up to the water's edge. Now don't have your brush too wet, but making it wet also means you can pull the glue in around these clumps that you see have dried that I put on after I turned the camera off. I left them overnight, and what we now have are some nice solid little, I guess you know what they're dunes or mounds, whatever we're gonna do with them later will be appropriate. So we just spread some more of this glue on, and I'm using my touch-up, one of my touch-up brushes here, obviously not the one I used to paint, and just bring the glue right in around the base of these mounds. So I'm not going to do it all. You know, there's no need for you to see everything in the process. But then we just come here and shake our sand on. Okay, so that's all we're going to do. We're just going to put the sand on the white glue. Now, make sure you don't want it too thick. We're not trying to make more of these mounds. You just want a thin layer where it will stick to the glue, and then I'm going to paint over that with the brown, which is why I said earlier you didn't have to paint the brown if you wanted to do this stage. I painted it earlier just to show how you can do it if you don't want to do this part. Normally I would not have painted this brown yet. I would have done this and then this first, because I'm going to fill in the sand around here, so I wouldn't have to worry about that paint flowing problem around the dried glue that I was talking about earlier, about how the undiluted paint is too thick to go around. That problem would have been solved by having the sand up against these clumps. So that's what's going to happen during the next part of this episode. Is you will see this will be sanded and it will be painted again, and the paint will be dry, which means we'll be ready to move on to the first part of our touch-ups, and we'll get to that next.